Welcome to another episode of the Entrepreneur Strategies Podcast, where we help you scale your wealth, health, and family well-being. And today we have a special guest on the show. So this is more of a sort of a niche subject matter. So we have Ken Sanginario with Corporate Value Metrics. He's the owner of Corporate Value Metrics on today's episode. And really today is all about creating value within our businesses. And so I think a lot of business owners will get value out of this. I really want to get to know a little bit about what Ken does, and specifically how we can create more value within our companies and why that's so important to all of us. I think as entrepreneurs, we sometimes lose focus on creating value within the companies. It's more about how can we pull income out of the company? How can we grow it bigger? But growing it bigger doesn't necessarily lead to value. And someday, obviously, that's the fruit of our labor, right? We created these businesses to be able to profit from it. And so it's important, I think, to concentrate on valuations sooner rather than later. And so, Ken, welcome to the show. And I'd love to hear a little bit about yourself and how you got started in this business.
Great. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate you having me on the show. Thanks. And you're absolutely right. A lot of business owners believe that growing top line and growing profitability lead to growing the value of the companies. And although that may be the case in many, many instances, that is absolutely not the case. It not only does it not necessarily create value, it actually might erode value. And I spent 18 years turning around underperforming and distressed companies, largely as a turnaround CEO or CFO or chief restructuring officer, often for private equity firms or bank workout groups. And one of the things I learned over the years, over and over and over, is that whenever I asked companies when I was first getting involved, hey, what was the company doing just before it started to slip into distress? Very often, the company was growing rapidly, or the company was trying to, say, raise capital, and they were chopping and slashing costs to get a higher EBITDA, higher profitability, thinking that they could get a higher multiple if they showed high growth and if they showed a higher EBITDA. But they do it all the wrong ways. And instead of sort of pursuing those goals in a value growth kind of manner, they chase revenue, and they end up chasing revenue that's outside of their comfort zone, outside of their typical geographic region, maybe outside of their typical size range. Maybe they're underbidding to try to get additional business and get more market share. And then on the expense side, they're chopping and slashing costs that they think are not customer facing, say. So they may be cutting back office costs. They may be cutting quality. They may be cutting insurance in some cases. Cutting sure. all these areas that they think, well, nobody will notice this, and it'll give us a boost in our EBITDA, and then it'll make it easier for us to sell or raise money or do joint ventures or whatever we're trying to do. And they go about it the wrong way, and they end up actually eroding the value of the company. And in many cases, they end up starting to slip into distress because they no longer have the infrastructure in place to support the high growth. They didn't have it in place in the first case, and then they start cutting back on it, and that really hurts. So that's a big part of my background, was 18 years turning around distressed companies. And you learn a lot of lessons. Once you turn around an underperforming or distressed company, you never have quite the same perspective again of looking at any company, because all the same problems that get distressed companies in trouble are lingering. They're in the background of even healthy companies. And if healthy companies aren't careful, they could slip down that same path.
And help me understand. So when you spent the last 18 years turning around distressed companies, so were you hired as sort of a consultant? What was your role to all of these companies? Did you work for those companies during those times, and they just all happened to be distressed at some point? Or if you could maybe share what your role was with those companies.
Yeah. So the first 8 years of that kind of work was as a turnaround CFO, where I actually worked for the companies. In the first case, it was sort of accidental. I got recruited in to be the CFO of a public company. It was sort of almost like a public private equity firm, if that makes any sense, because it was a public company very broadly held on the debt side, more closely held on the equity side. But it had a portfolio of disparate operating companies. And the whole goal of the company was to keep growing the portfolio of operating companies. It had raised a lot of capital to do so. And it was a public company. So it was, this was back in the early 90s. And it was the first time that I ever had to personally sign an SEC filing, way before, say, Sarbanes-Oxley and all of that whole debacle. But I still took it very seriously because I was a CPA. I came out of the Big Eight in the late 80s. And but having to sign my first SEC filing, I ended up having to go myself and sort of do an analysis of all of the portfolio companies. And I realized that the companies, a number of them were underwater and in covenant default on debt arrangements and so forth. And I had to report all that to the SEC. And that basically thrust us into what ended up to be a 3-year, very grueling turnaround and workout of the company and all the portfolio companies involved. It was, when I first realized the situation, I thought, well, I should really turn and run for the hills because this is not what was represented to me as I was getting recruited in to help grow the portfolio. But then I thought,
bit off a little more than you were expecting to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had never been through a turnaround before. And so it was new to me, but I thought, well, maybe there's something here that I can learn from and take with me and have a great experience. I thought it might take a year. It ended up taking 3 years. But it all worked out. Everything got restructured. The company survived and kept going forward and so forth. At that point, I had it in my blood. This turnaround buzz kind of was in my blood, and I intentionally then went to a distressed private equity backed multi-unit company, and got recruited there as a turnaround CFO. And I spent several years there. We restructured that company, raised a lot of new private capital to grow it and so forth. Went through an IPO process. I spent a year of my life laying the groundwork for an IPO of that company, all the SEC filings. We spent 20 days on the road. We did 100 road shows in 20 days all around the U.S. and outside the U.S. This was back in 9. We got all the way to the finish line, and the day before the pricing meeting, the Dow dropped by 350 points, which today's standards, that's nothing.
Yeah, that's today. That's not even a percent.
It's not even. But back then, it was a huge drop, and thankfully, I had backstop financing lined up, and so we took the backstop financing and pulled the IPO. And I stayed around for another year, but I knew we weren't going back to the public markets. It was too distracting to the business and so forth. But I had that turnaround sort of drive in me. And so I ended up leaving and forming a turnaround firm with several partners. It was a combination of turnarounds and M&A advisory, and then spent 10 or 12 years with that group turning around. And in those cases, I was being brought in as a turnaround consultant, but typically on a full-time basis. So a private equity firm would bring me in to be interim CEO. So I would literally take over the running of the company, have full authority, full autonomy to develop and execute a turnaround strategy. And then on the back end, we would either sell or recapitalize the company as the owners preferred. And those engagements typically were anywhere from 6 to 18 months at a time. So full-time, deep dive, 100% on the road. And very interesting, a lot of very interesting companies, a lot of very interesting challenges, a lot of really valuable lessons learned and insights developed. And as I say, once you go through that, your perspectives are just different forevermore. And so I did that for in total about 18 years of actual turning around distressed companies. Well, as part of our turnaround practice, so now fast forward to the recession of 2008 and 2009, my partners and I were getting a lot of assessment engagements from some of the big banks in the Northeast, Bank of America, Citizens, Santander, those kinds of banks, from the workout groups in the banks. And the reason was the workout groups were getting inundated with a lot of companies that were getting pushed into workout, and they didn't have the bandwidth to even triage the influx. So we became one of their key triage groups, outside triage groups. And the mandate was, hey, go spend a week or two in the field with X, Y, or Z company, do an assessment, come back, write us a report, let us know, hey, is this a train wreck that we need to deal with right away, or can we put it on the back burner? Can it be fixed? And if so, how? Can you help fix it? All of those kind of questions. So my partners and I started doing these engagements, a lot of them, and we did them individually. And they were all, the fees were capped and the timetables were kind of capped as well. And so we all did high quality work. We were all very experienced. But one day, after about a year of that, I pulled a lot of our reports into a conference room and I laid them out on the table. I called my partners together and I said, hey guys, look, individually, these are all high quality reports. But if not for the logo on the cover page, the banks would never know these came from the same firm, because we all interview clients our own way, our own style. Our writing styles are all different. We write about topics in different sequences and different levels of depth and so forth. We all get to the same conclusions that the rest of us would get to if somebody else did it, but we get there a very different way. And this is not scalable. We can't teach anybody. We can't teach associates how to do this because they're all different. And I have some ideas. We could be adding a lot more value to these engagements. We could be doing it in less time, adding more value and being more profitable and so forth. So I said, we need a standardized approach that will help us to cover all of the issues of the company in a more comprehensive way, in a more value added way. And oh, by the way, we can sort of do a qualitative diagnostic of the company, but we can also tie it to a valuation calculation. So the quality profile and the risk profile on the company can inform the valuation of the business, rather than looking outside at multiples of companies that bear little or no relationship to the company that we're looking at.
Sure.
We can actually integrate it and tie it all together and make it specific to that company. So that's what I set out to do. Sorry.
I definitely want to dive into that. I want to save that a little bit for the end, because that's a really important piece. Obviously, that's how I got to know you, Ken, is through your valuation tool. And so that is something I definitely want to dig into. I guess I first want to focus on, first of all, I didn't even know turnaround CFOs existed. I guess it makes sense. I guess I just didn't realize that was in such high demand. And when you worked with all these companies and you were helping these distressed companies turn themselves around, it sounds like across the board there might have been some similarities between all these companies. And so what do you think were some of the most common causes of the distress, of the almost a meteoric plunge? What caused those for each of those companies?
Yeah, great question. And what I saw over those years is that whatever the background was of the CEO or the owner or founder of the particular company, let's say they were an engineer or they came from operations, the company would be strongest in that particular area, but it would be weakest and it would have blind spots in the other sort of natural opposite areas of the owner's personality, say. So if they were an engineer and they're really strong in operations, they'd probably be strong in any of the technical areas, operations, maybe finance, that kind of thing. They would be weakest in, say, the soft skills, say leadership or marketing or sales. Sometimes they'd be strong in sales, sometimes they wouldn't, but certainly they would be weakest in kind of the natural personality opposite areas. And those were their blind spots. But when we looked at where have they been spending all of their time and energy and resources, where do you think they would have been investing it all?
I guess it depends on the personality, but probably into the infrastructure of the company, I would imagine.
Well, that's where they should have invested, but they were investing it kind of in the areas where they were already strongest, because that was their passion. So if they were an engineer, and they were strong in operations, they would continually be investing in operations.
Yeah, makes
So
sense.
they would pump more and they would grow sales, and operations would be able to handle it, but none of the other functional categories of the company would be able to handle it.
Mm-hmm.
Administratively, quality, um, the HR function was very often weak in companies, so they didn't have the right training programs. They couldn't recruit the right kind of people. They tried to hire people on cheap. They did a lot of things that prevented them from being able to support the growth that they were investing in trying to build. And so the more they would pile on top line, the more pressure they would put. It's like the chain is only as strong as its weakest link. They would continually put more and more pressure on the weak links of their infrastructure, and eventually those weak links would become fail points, and
Mm-hmm.
the fail points then would start to cause problems internally, culturally. They would not be aligned culturally. They would start to do a lot of finger pointing. They would have late deliveries or quality control problems or supply chain problems, or all kinds of issues that would crop up because they didn't have the infrastructure in place, and they weren't balanced as a company. So they would start to slip and slide, and then they would start losing customers because they couldn't deliver on time, and it just would become a downward spiral. And that's how it happens very quickly.
Yeah, I can imagine. And so, what are some of the strongest recommendations that you made to them? So, for instance, if it is more of the engineer type of personality, they spend, all this money into technology and people within the operations space, and maybe not so much on the sales, on the growth side. Is it just as simple as they should then be hiring, looking for talent to hire in the areas where they're the weakest?
Um, Sometimes, but we would always start with, hey, we need to figure out, we can establish kind of a current state diagnostic on the company across the whole enterprise. So we would be able to identify where their strengths and weaknesses really were, and that would give us a good picture of the current state of the business. But before we went and started hiring people or investing in other areas, we needed to then establish a future state picture of where the company wanted to go in the future, and then figure out, okay, what will it take to go from where they are today to where they would like to go in the future? And we would look out 3 to 5 years in the future. Beyond looking out further than that was not really that helpful, but
Yeah.
3 to 5 years was enough so that we could actually execute on the
You can
plan.
create action steps for 3 to 5 years. It's difficult to
Yeah.
create action steps for a 10-year, 15-year plan. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And so once we had that future vision and everybody bought into it, including the ownership or the investors, if it was a private equity backed firm, then we would build out the tactical plans of, okay, what's it going to take now to execute this? What do we need for people? What do we need for systems? What do we need for sales and marketing personnel and so forth? Do we need marketing plans? Can our supply chain uh, uphold the demands that we might be creating? So a lot of integration of what was needed in terms of executing the plan, and that's how we would do it. And it had to happen fast though, because a lot of these companies were literally out of money. When I would get the call, sometimes I would get a call on, say, a Thursday or a Friday of the week, and the call would be, "Hey, Ken, we have this portfolio company out in the Midwest, and they just told us they're not going to make payroll on next Thursday, and they need an infusion, and we don't know whether we should give the infusion of capital or just close the doors and shut it down, but we need an answer. Can you get on the ground by Monday morning? You'll have a couple, 2, 3 days to let us, maybe a couple days to let us know, can this be fixed? How long will it take? What would it cost? Like, what's involved? And then we have a day to make a decision and get the money funded into the company. I mean, in some cases, it was that much of a crisis. Not always.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them we had a lot more runway to work with. Ideally, we would say, okay, the first thing we needed to do was stretch the runway of how long the companies can survive without more cash. And so we
Yeah.
would, those would be some of the first steps that we would take. give the recommendation to the investors or the owner about what they needed to do and can this be fixed. And not always could it be fixed. Sometimes they just waited too long. They let it slide too far. Sometimes it could be fixed, but it was going to take a lot of work, like several years of work. So,
Sure.
yeah.
And so what, first of all, how long would it take to turn around some of these companies? And then what would you say the valuation difference was? So
Mm.
when you're coming in and you're noticing the problems that are existing within these companies, I I would imagine you did some sort of valuation assessment at that time. And then
Hmm.
do you do another valuation assessment at the end of that project?
We would. And in some cases, the company was pretty much worthless at the outset because they had more debt than the company was worth. And
Mm-hmm.
I think of several cases where the owners had personally guaranteed a lot of debt, and the company wasn't even worth the amount that the company owed back to the lenders. So the owners would have been on the hook to come out of pocket and pay off that debt. And that might take us 12 to 15 to 18 months kind of to turn that company around and get it to the point where it could be sold or recapitalized and we could get the owners off of their personal guarantees, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And in cases where the company was sold, um, it's if it had no equity value at the very outset, then and we could sell it for 18 months later for $5 or $10 million. Well, that's a huge win.
Yeah, yeah, and so it sounds like as you're discussing some of the examples that where you kind of came in and you turned around those companies,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like they're a bit of larger companies, probably revenue, obviously debt exceeding their revenue in the beginning, but revenue is probably in the millions. What about for small businesses? What
Mm-hmm.
what are some ways that smaller businesses can learn to scale as well as
Yeah.
create more value within their companies?
Yeah. It's a great question, Mike. Most private companies, regardless of their size, should be able to double or triple the value of their companies in 3 to 5 years. We always say
Wow.
double in 2 to 3, triple in 3 to 5.
Wow.
And it all starts with a thorough, comprehensive understanding of where they are today. So that's the whole current state analysis or diagnostic. They need to know where their strengths and weaknesses are. And every company has weaknesses. Every company has blind spots. And most owners don't realize that they have blind spots. So they
Yeah.
think that they think those areas where they're weak are just unimportant areas when they're in terms of supporting growth, they're very important. All the areas are kind of equally important because any one area can become a fail point. So you start with that sort of current state assessment, and then you have to build a vision of the future state of the company. What do the owners want to look like if they fell asleep for the next 3 to 5 years and woke up? Describe the company. What would they want that company to ideally look like? How big would it be? How many employees would they have? What would the culture be? What would the facilities look like? What were their product lines or service lines look like? That kind of thing. So you get this really crystal clear picture of where the company wants to go in the future, and then you can build a scalable action plan to go from here to there. It doesn't mean they have to, do everything all at once, but you need to build the action plan so that they understand where they need to invest in the company at which stages of growth. It doesn't mean
Yep.
they need a full leadership team right today because that would be overkill and they couldn't afford it anyway, and neither do they need it. But they need to have all the primary functions covered. They have to have a resource to help them in all of the functional areas. And maybe it's an outsourced resource for now where they just tap into it when and as needed. But you build the plan so that at certain stages of growth, they start bringing some of those outsourced functions in-house, or they start adding new equipment or expanding their facilities or expanding their marketing plan or whatever the case may be. Every case is different depending on where they are today and where they want to go. But you can
Yeah,
build
sure.
that scalable plan and then execute it. It really becomes a way of thinking of for the business owners, not only owners, but their whole leadership teams and then down through the organization. If you get the whole organization thinking along the lines of okay, we're executing a long-term plan here. We all understand our roles within that plan. We all have responsibilities. We all have accountability, and
Yep.
we all know how what we do is driving the company forward to reach its ultimate goal. Then that's how companies can double or triple in value in 3 to 5 years. It's not rocket science, but it is a very disciplined, focused process.
Yeah, and as you just said, it's not rocket science because as I'm listening to this, it's some of the listeners might be like, well, yeah, okay, this seems like a no-brainer, right? Because it sounds like very simple steps, but it's not always, especially creating culture within a company.
Right.
In addition, I think the delegation piece to it. There's too many entrepreneurs that are very they want to do everything themselves. They want to have too much control in their companies, and it's very difficult for them to be able to delegate and to let other people run with it.
Yeah.
And so to give the listeners sort of more of a real life example, and I know this is all completely hypothetical, and so you probably can't give like specific steps. But let's say somebody owns a golf store, and their vision is they want to have 5 golf stores across one state. And right now they have 1 golf store. Sales are pretty good, but certainly could be better. Well, I mean, if you came into a company like that, what do you think some of those action steps are? Because you keep mentioning the current reality to the future vision, and you create an action step plan between those. But could you maybe elaborate on what some steps might be?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you're using an example of a kind of a multi-unit retail concept. It's actually an industry that I happen to have a fair amount of experience in addition to manufacturing and so forth. So in a retail concept like that, one of the first diagnoses that we would do is called a 4-wall analysis. You need to really understand the location that exists right now. You need to understand the kind of the unit economics of it. Where is it? Who's the target market, first of all? Who's your target customer? What are the demographics of that target customer? And where do those customers come from? So you need to understand like the trade area where the actual location is. Is there enough density of people within your target customer base within the 1, 3, 5 mile range? How far would customers come to visit your store? Then you need to understand all of the economics of the store itself. How expensive is it to build it out? How big are the lease costs? Did you get any tenant improvement money to kind of build it out? How much inventory do you need to carry? What other products or services do you need to offer? Are you operating at kind of peak or optimal efficiency in terms of the products that you're offering, the services that you're providing, the hours that where you're operating? Are you generating enough revenue to make this a successful unit, one unit? You have to basically use the unit that you have to build a prototype, a very detailed prototype of the new units that you want to open. And then be very disciplined about where they are. I helped the owner of a gym franchise. He had a franchise of gyms, and we did a similar process. He wasn't struggling; he just wanted to grow. He had 3 units. When I met him, he wanted to grow. He was kind of landlocked by his franchise agreement, so he had competitors in different and contiguous regions. But the competitors, so he had me kind of go around and do a sort of a secret shopper assessment of all the competitors. And when I did, I realized operationally they were way subpar compared to the way he operated his gyms. And so there was an opportunity for him to go acquire them because they weren't operating at optimal performance or efficiency. So he probably could acquire them at a low value.
At a
Now,
pretty big discount. Yeah.
big discount. So that's what we did. We went around and we bought the competitors, opened up his regions, and then he went from 3 stores up to, I think, 18 stores before he ended up selling the whole bunch. But he operated them at a very high level. If he was going to build, and in some cases he didn't only acquire, he built new gyms as well.
Okay.
But we developed a very detailed prototype of the location of the kind of the ideal gym. What's the ideal size? What's the ideal mix of equipment? What are the ideal densities and demographics of the area? Highway access, signage availability, all of these kind of factors. People don't want to get off the highway and drive 6 miles to get. They want to get off the highway and have 2 blocks to pull in the parking lot.
So I always look for the closest and the most convenient gym. Yeah, the location I imagine in that industry is extremely important.
Yeah, but I mean, same in a golf store, it's the same way. In a fast food restaurant, it's the same thing. I mean, it's you have to build that unit economic target prototype and then be very diligent about and careful about where you open. I was the one of the turnarounds where I was the CFO was a multi-unit company, and we had to go through that process. That's where I first learned kind of all about the unit economics and that was a company that we turned around. We spent a couple of years turning it around and then recapitalized it and then went through the IPO back in the late 90s, mid to late 90s and so forth. So, but we did a rollout and it had to be really, really careful about where the locations were and all the economics of them. So
sure.
Yeah.
And when you talk about that, because I find that very interesting for many different industries of the decision of whether to acquire, so whether to buy already existing similar businesses or competitors in that example, or to build. And I think that's a difficult decision for a lot of people. What is the best way to do it, to build it from the ground up where you already have influence over the culture, or to just acquire and take over and then try and build the culture within those additional stores?
Yeah, it really depends a lot. I know that's a kind of a non-answer, but it depends on the company. It depends on the leadership team involved. It depends on what the concept is. It depends on whether the acquisition targets are even available, and if so, are they close enough to the target unit economics that you're looking for. If they're not, then you probably just want to build your own. If they're in good locations and it's just a matter of managing them better, well, then maybe you can acquire them. So in the case where I was the CFO of the multi-unit company, it was better for us to build. So we built every unit from scratch inside shopping malls or strip centers, that kind of thing. In the case of the client I had with the gyms, it was initially better for him to acquire. So he acquired, I think we acquired maybe 8 units, something like that. 3 or 4 competitors, 8 total units. But that opened up his territory. He could not build first. First, he had to acquire to open up his territories. And once he opened up his territories, then he had more room to build. So he acquired. In some cases, he acquired the business, but then moved the location. In some cases, he acquired and just ran it better because he had a really good management team. But once he was able to do that and then stabilize the companies, the units that he acquired, then he could start looking for locations to build from scratch. And that's what he did. Okay. So it could be one or the other. It could be a combination. It really depends a lot on the situation.
Yeah. And when you're acquiring new locations, I'm wondering, do they do this is the best way to do this through private equity? Do you do it through bank loans? Like how typically are they, acquiring not just one, but multiple locations like that?
Yeah. I mean, he, in his, well, again, it sort of depends. So in the case of the gyms, my client with the gyms, he didn't take any private equity. He took bank debt and landlord like tenant improvement money. So whenever he was building, he would get a lot of money from the landlords toward the build out, and that would get built into the long-term leases that he would sign.
Yep.
and he would get bank debt to finance the equipment that he had to purchase. And
Okay.
so, yeah, did he have a lot of bank debt? Yeah, he had a lot of bank debt, but it was fine because every unit stood on its own in terms of can it service the bank debt that he put on it. And
Yeah.
in the end, near the end, the bank was they couldn't wait to fund another new build or another acquisition because every unit he had was performing really strongly. So
Yeah.
he didn't have to take any private equity to do it. In the case of when I was the CFO of the company that had the multi units, we had private equity and we took tenant improvement money and so forth. But those units were much more expensive. Those were a couple $1,000,000 to open a new unit. So it wasn't anything that we could do just with tenant improvement money and bank debt. It wasn't enough. We needed
Yeah.
more. So we had private equity involved as well.
Okay. Yeah. And so maybe for some of those business owners, and maybe they're, they're still in the beginning stages or maybe in the first 5 years of existence. I think a lot of times entrepreneurs don't focus enough on the valuation of their companies. I think they think, what can I get out of it?
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe they have the thought that someday in the future they could sell it, but they're not really focusing on it throughout the journey. They're really just thinking, well, someday when I feel like retiring, I'm just going to sell it. And
Mm-hmm.
so what would your response be? What are some of the reasons why focusing on value up front in the beginning is necessary? And even if they just plan on using it for the income, using their businesses for the income they get out of it, what are some reasons why they may be overlooking the importance of valuation of their companies?
Yeah, well, so sort of just a few high-level market statistics that might put this in perspective, and then I'll give you a more detailed answer. But
Yeah, that's great.
Say roughly 6 million operating businesses in the U.S. that actually have employees. Okay, there's about 12 million total businesses, but 6 million of them actually have employees. The vast majority of them are what we call in the micro market. So only about maybe under 400,000 of them are generating revenue greater than 5 million. The rest of those 6 million basically are sub 5 million in revenue. And the vast majority of those are down in the 1 to 3 million revenue range. Okay, so 6 million businesses, 70% of them are baby boomer owned. So let's just call it 4 million of those, right?
Wow.
About 80 to 90% of those 4 million are not sellable today. So that's roughly
Wow.
3.5 million of those businesses are not sellable today, and they're baby boomer owned, meaning that they will have to transfer ownership sometime in the next 10 years.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Now, those are business owners that their line of thinking is exactly what you just described. They ran their businesses to make the money that they make. They either ran them as a kind of a hobby business, or they ran them as a for their career, but not thinking about the long-term value, only thinking about the profitability that could support them. Thinking and all the while thinking, hey, this is profitable. I can sell this whenever I want, and when I'm ready to retire, I'll sell it, and it will support me for the rest of my life. That's a big fallacy. And my fear is that the vast majority of those companies are, they very likely will end up dying on the vine. And that's a tragedy, because they will not have the value to support the owner's lifestyles for the rest of their lives. And now you have all these owners that have worked all their whole lives, and they're not going to be able to retire, or they're going to just end up shutting the business down and have very little, if anything, to keep supporting them. So that's the problem. And the reason that happens is they try to grow revenue, but they're not growing the kind of revenue that creates value. They might grow, again, as I alluded to this in the beginning of this conversation, they might grow outside of their geographic area. They might grow outside of their normal comfort zone. They start doing one-off. They get requests from customers. Well, we like what you have, but could you do this a little differently? Yeah, we can do that a little differently. And then somebody else, yeah, we can do that a little differently on the other side. And they start getting product creep. Basically, their products or services start creeping and becoming less focused, more diluted, more spread out, harder to control, harder to price, harder to staff, harder to train, harder to have systems that can handle it. All of these kinds of issues that crop up when companies start to just chase revenue and lose the focus of what they're really good at.
Yeah, and I can imagine it's a little bit like selling a house. Sometimes I think people's egos get caught up
Yeah.
in the business, and they think it's really great, but because they didn't really focus on actually building a business for other people and building value within that, whether it's a house or a business or whatever, I think they end up having a bit of a rude awakening when they realize just because they think it's great doesn't mean it is great to somebody else.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. In the case of companies that want to sell, it's all about what somebody is buying. What are they buying? They're not buying what the company has done in the past. So a lot of times owners will say to me, like a good example, another client that I had, a manufacturing plastic injection molding company. The owner said to me, Ken, I started this business 30 years ago. It's been profitable every year for 30 years. I want to sell it in the next 2 or 3 years. I should get a premium for that, right? Because it's been profitable all these years. I said, okay, well, let me take a look around. Let's spend a couple hours, and then I'll tell you what I think. We walk around the plant, and I realize he basically he does everything. Yes, he has a staff that runs the machines and everything, but he's the owner. He's the engineer. He's the salesperson. His sister is his bookkeeper. His father is his chairman. It's like he has no leadership team really at all. And he works from 4:30 in the morning until 9 or 10 o'clock at night every night. He's been doing that for 30 years. He has no family of his own. And I had said to him at the end of it, look, you have never institutionalized the knowledge base of this company. It's all in your head. And he was a very smart guy. He had some technology that allowed him to work with plastic resins that nobody else could work with. So he had a long-running customer base that was loyal and so forth, but nobody else could do it except him. He had to calibrate the machines every morning to run the right cycle times at the right temperatures and that kind of thing. And I said to him, look, if a crane came in one day and lifted you up and put you out in the parking lot and dropped in another operator who maybe has plastic injection molding, experience even, but they don't know the secret sauce that's in your head, they wouldn't be able to run this company. Nobody could run this company except for you. So unless you want to go work for a buyer for the next 5 years and teach them everything, you need to start now and institutionalize all the knowledge, become independent of you.
Yep. And that goes back to the what I was commenting on earlier with a lot of business owners having a hard time with delegation. And I think part of it is an ego thing. Nobody can do it as good as they can. And so because of that ego, they continue to do everything on their own. Well, the problem with that is, when you are the business then. And so if that person retires, if you want to retire as that business owner, well, then the business goes away because you are the business. And so I think a lot of times it's getting over the ego and understanding that you can teach people the skills and the knowledge that you have, and you should do that if you ever actually want to create a business that can be sold to somebody else and be able to continue to run, without you being at the helm.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, Mike. And as I said, buyers don't buy what a company has done in the past. They're buying the future revenue or the future cash stream of the business. So they're buying the sustainability, the predictability, the transferability of the business. What does the future look like? Even if the company was profitable in the past, if it can't be profitable without the current owner staying in the business for a long period of time, then there's really not a lot of value that anybody's going to pay a premium for. They might
Yeah.
buy the facility, they might buy the equipment, but it's going to be more of a book value buy, not a premium buy. So I had
Yeah.
to, I mean, that's tough love that I had to give that client and let him know that, like, you have to start now, and it might take you 5 years. This is not something you're going to be able to do in 1 or 2 years. It's going to take
Yeah.
you probably 4 or 5 years to get this company to be sellable now.
Yeah, and nobody
And
wants to be in that position, which is why it is important to start that work
yeah,
sooner rather than later. Because if in that particular gentleman's situation, he probably thought, he's gonna be cruising into retirement, and then unfortunately to find out he's actually got to stick around another five
yeah,
years.
yeah. Um, I have another client that was another contract manufacturer, and the first day I met him, he said to me, Ken, I feel like we're in a death spiral. We're getting squeezed by our customers on pricing. We're getting squeezed by our suppliers on the cost of components and that kind of thing. And the management team has no energy. And he said, this company is 25 years old. He said, if somebody came this afternoon and offered me a bagel for this business, I'd probably take it. And and we went
Yikes.
through a process, a diagnostic process. We gave him a really clear picture of his current state. It didn't have much value at all. I mean, he owed about as much debt as the business was worth. So there wasn't, if he tried to sell it, there wasn't much equity value there. But we helped him build a vision of the future along with his leadership team. We helped them build an action plan to execute it. They executed it for about 6 years, and then had a very successful sale to a private equity firm at that after
Wow.
that point.
Yeah.
And that took 6 years or so. But
Wow.
along the way, they actually became sellable about maybe 3 or 4 years into the process. But when I went and said to him, like, okay, you've come a long way. You could probably sell it now and make enough to, support you during your retirement age. And he said, no, look around. I'm having fun again. The leadership team is having fun again. There's a lot of energy here. We see a lot more opportunity. I want to get to another level, at least one more, if not two more levels, and
That's
then
amazing.
sell. So that
Yep.
also happens. And a lot of times business owners, they get stuck in a routine and stuck in a rut. They don't know how to get out of it. They don't know who to ask or who to trust.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they
And I can echo that as a business owner. I think we all kind of go through moments like that. It's you
yeah,
you stuck in a routine, and because of that, you don't really get that 30,000-foot view
right.
of what's really happening within the company.
Yeah.
So, Ken, one of the reasons why I really wanted to have you on the show, as you and I both know, but maybe not our listeners, you have a valuation tool that helps businesses create value, and then on top of that, you help people get certified in what's called the Certified Value Growth Advisor. And as a
Right.
financial planner who works specifically with business owners, I've always found that I'm really able to help them benefit the most that they can out of their businesses and help them on their personal financial side, as well as some of the overarching things that they can do within their company, profit and loss analysis, that type of stuff. That I found that I was maybe lacking in providing, the total advice is I want to help them grow their businesses. So not just on the personal side, but within the business itself. And I guess I've always felt like that was maybe going a little bit too far, but I really, at the end of the day, I want to help them grow their business so they
Yeah.
can benefit personally from that, because that's the
Sure.
whole point of building these businesses. And that was the original idea, is how can I benefit from this,
Right.
building this creation? And so I've been strongly considering going through your certification program, getting the Certified Value Growth Advisor designation,
Yeah.
and then using the evaluation tool that you have to offer. So maybe if you could just talk a little bit about the designation, what sets those advisors apart with the designation, and then in addition, how this tool can really provide great advice and value to business owners.
Sure. Great question, and thanks for asking, Mike, and giving me a chance to talk about that a little bit. The valuation tool is a software platform. It's called the Value Opportunity Profile, and that's what started back with my partners, when I said, hey, we need a more standardized process, I started developing a process that I thought would allow us to do a more comprehensive assessment of a company across the entire enterprise, cover all the key functional areas, tie that to a valuation um, module. So I have a strong valuation background, a strong M&A background. So my fields of expertise are turnaround management, mergers and acquisitions, and due diligence and business valuations. And when I set out to develop the software, these knowledge bases they all leverage each other, and nobody had ever put them together in a way that would make them easily used, user friendly, but be able to sort of leverage each of those so that somebody doesn't have to be a real expert to do a full diagnostic of a company. They just have to kind of follow the yellow brick road, so to speak, in the software. Just answer the questions as they come up and plug in the information, and the system does the rest. So we developed that, and the software gives a full qualitative assessment of the company across almost 50 categories in total. And it's done ideally as a facilitated process. So who's ever using it sits with the leadership team of the company. They walk through a questionnaire. Now, how long does it take? It depends on the size of the company. We have different tiers for different sizes. We have a tier for really small companies that are under 5 million in revenue. That can be done in a couple hours. And then there's a financial table that gets populated, and the qualitative and risk assessment on the company flows into the valuation module. So we're using all the valuation methodologies as well. And that creates what we call an intrinsic valuation on the company. It's not what the company necessarily would sell for this afternoon if the company wanted to go out in the market and try to sell it. It's what the inherent value is. And the idea is that the intrinsic or inherent value is controllable by the business owner. They can double or triple that intrinsic value over a 3 to 5 year period. That theoretically would put them, if they ever do go to sell, would put them at the high end of wherever the transaction value range might be in the market. But the transaction values are volatile, right? That they go up and down as conditions in the market change, as the economy changes, as industries become hot or cold, as buyers become hot or cold. The transaction value of companies changes, but the intrinsic value is controllable by the owner. So they should always be at the highest end of the intrinsic value, would always put them at the highest end of the transaction value as well. So that's how the software works. The software will establish a baseline value and generate a roadmap, a prioritized roadmap that says, hey, Mr. Owner or Ms. Owner, over the next 3 to 5 years, this is the sequence of areas that you need to work on to bring the company into better balance and position it to be able to support growth. And if you do these things, we can tell you in advance how much value you will be adding to the business. So it's a predictive as well. It says, here's what you need to do. If you do these 10 things, you're going to add 30, 40% to the baseline value. If you keep going for the next couple of years, you'll end up doubling the value. But we can show you at a granular level how much intrinsic value you'll be adding for any improvement initiative that you undertake. That's the software. And that's been out now. It's turning 10 this year. And
wow.
It's used by advisors all around the U.S. and outside the U.S. Exit planners, turnaround consultants, some private equity investors, business valuation firms, even some attorneys and CPAs and so forth. So lots of different professionals are using it to serve their clients, to establish baseline values, to show their clients what they need to be doing to double or triple their values.
That's incredible.
And then when we first started launching it, a couple years into, maybe a year or so into that launch, a lot of advisors were coming to us saying, hey, we love the software. Our clients love what it generates. They love the process. But now our clients want us to help them implement what's in the software report. And we don't know how to do that because we have a financial background. We
Right.
don't have a marketing background or an operations background,
Right.
right? We don't know those areas and they need guidance. Can you help us? Can you teach us? So that's what gave rise to the certification program, because at the time I looked around and I was looking for any kind of education program that already existed where people could learn the fundamentals of a company, of a business across all of the primary functional categories, not to be an expert in marketing or sales or HR or whatever operations, but to have a conversational knowledge, to have a baseline knowledge of the fundamentals of any company across those functional areas. And so I couldn't find it anywhere. It didn't exist. It still doesn't exist other than in our program. So I developed a framework that I thought would really kind of solve the gap in the marketplace, the educational gap, because it sort of sits in between. There's valuation training, there's M&A training, there's exit planning training, there's turnaround training. It sits in between all of these different training and certification programs and ties them all together, because
Sure.
because none of them have the front end that is needed for whatever they're training on. This is sort of the front end that feeds into any of those other processes. Whether you want to value a company, sell it, turn it around, whatever you want to do, you need to have a thorough understanding and a thorough knowledge of the business at the very beginning. So that's what our training and certification program does. Is I went out and I recruited a high caliber instructor team. So we have 8 or 9 instructors that come in and teach different modules. It's a 5-day program. They teach all the fundamentals of business across the primary functional categories. Then we have some special sessions during the week as well. There's a finance boot camp that teaches all about capitalization rates and discount rates and how to use those strategically and so forth. We have a strategic planning session that where we teach advisors or even business owners how to go through a strategic planning process with your company or with your client. And we have a framework that we've developed. We have a curriculum that we developed. We have templates and readings and so forth. So we give all of that in the program. And then we have some value added sessions like cultural alignment and the power of cultural alignment. We have a special instructor for that session. We have some sessions on building your client pipeline, how to introduce these kinds of services to your client. So a whole host of different topics that we cover. And there's a case study that runs through the week. It's a live case. The week is very comprehensive, very rigorous. The live case, people work on the case in teams during the week. And then on Friday morning, each team turns in a report with all of their conclusions and recommendations to the company in the case. And then the owner of the company in the case actually attends in person our sessions and listens to everybody's recommendations. And then he gets up and talks about all the decision points in the case, what he actually decided in real time when it happened, which ones worked, which ones didn't, and why, and so forth. So that ties the whole week together. And then there's an exam, an online exam that people have a couple weeks to take and so forth. And then they get the CVGA certification. And then to support people going forward, we have the Value Growth Community, which is a combination of a private portal where we have additional training, articles, knowledge sharing among all of our members and so forth. We post, people can post questions, people can collaborate, load their bios and collaborate with each other. So there's a lot there. We have a mentorship program that we're just launching. And actually next week, we're kicking it off, a mentorship program for new practitioners to this area that are being coached by more experienced practitioners. We have a monthly community call where people can get on a Zoom call like this. And we have a topic of the month, but there's a lot of knowledge sharing and best practices and just helping each other to create awareness, because we all have the same goal in mind. We all want to help companies, those 3.5 million companies that are not sellable today that will need to we want to reach as many of those companies as we can, because collectively we can make an impact on the economy, on the middle market economy. Individually, we can't individually touch enough companies, but collectively, if we all follow a similar process, we can actually make an impact on those 3.5 million companies.
Yeah, that's great, and I think that's a really great note to end on. I mean, it is it's not just for the business owners to be able to create value and be able to sell their company and make lots of money. This is really the heart of America. This is
Exactly.
the middle market of our economy, as you just mentioned, and it's really important for all of us to help those companies grow and to be able to help our overall economic state. So. I learned so much from this episode. I actually think this is the longest episode to date because you had so much valuable information to share. I took a lot away from it, what business owners can really be focused on so that they're not missing the blind spots that exist there, the importance of starting early and understanding the value of the company, and then being able to take the action steps necessary to be able to build those companies up. And quite frankly, so that maybe they can perhaps retire at an earlier age than they anticipated, and so those are important things to focus on. And you provided a lot of insights for me to even think about within my business. So I appreciate your time today. I know we'll be continuing to talk because I am very interested in the Certified Value Growth Advisor designation. It's something that, as we shared, I think is so important to be able to not only help the business owner be able to benefit on the personal side, but really helping them make significant changes within their business that are going to make long-term improvements to not only them, their business, and honestly be able to enjoy their personal lives and their personal health, even more because they were able to create that value early enough in their companies. So Ken, thank you so much for being on the Entrepreneur Strategies podcast. Very much look forward to catching back up and continuing to learn from you and receive some of that mentorship that you just provided to all of our audience here.
Great. Thanks, Mike. My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Thanks, Ken. Take care.
You too.